We are still in the midst of our discussing the thorny issue of morality. Does the Torah determine what morality is, or do we? Religious belief versus human responsibility. Now, we note that the source sheet that appears on the screen currently on the social and rational imperative as distinct from the Torah is the source sheet we discussed 2 sessions ago, and the emphasis on that social and rational imperative being distinct from the Torah was, of course, a reference to what we do regard as an autonomous system of morality, but that's not the Torah. That's, if anything, the Noachide covenant. And we discussed at great length what morality means in that context, the imperatives with which one has a kind of intuitive resonance. And while that does, as we noted, enunciate that deeply rooted intuitive sense of justice and what is right, with which each and every human being, Jew and Gentile, is natively endowed, that's not the Torah. One can intuit the Noachide laws, one cannot intuit the Torah. And with that, in particular, prompted us to discuss last time, the next source sheet in this series was the inscrutable authoritarian imperative, the Torah as a chok, which on some plane was the other side of the same coin. In other words, that the Noachide code is indeed that social and rational imperative that we can intuit. The Torah is not. And in some sense, then, in speaking of the Torah as chok, we are underlying the extent to which we indeed are not capable of resonating with everything in the Torah. And we noted at the outset, of course, some of the clear illustrations of that which God ordains in the Torah with which we don't resonate. And of course, the first example that we noted was the Akedah, the summons of Abraham to bring his son Yitzchak as an olah, as a burnt offering. And likewise, on a public communal plane, the Mitzvoth of extirpation of the Canaanite nations, the imperative to extirpate Amalek. And in particular, we focused upon an additional dimension, perhaps more subtly, the extent to which, prima facie, God is commanding Moshe to engage in what we would describe as subterfuge, in telling Paro relentlessly, as we noted, over and over again, 3 days, a 3-day reprieve, even though the game plan had called for, at the outset, the entire, absolute, complete liberation of Israel from bondage in Egypt. And we noted on a number of planes how we can deal with this glaring incongruity. And we aren't going to repeat all the various answers that we discussed last time. I'm just going to stress the last one that on some plane, in as much as the Exodus is really the prelude to the theophany at Sinai, the whole thrust of the Exodus is a lead up to that. It's important to get this point across from the get-go, that when you are ready to receive the Torah, you aren't going to evaluate the Torah based upon that internal moral compass, that intuitive sense of right and wrong. You need to defer to what God ordains as right and wrong. So, of course, on some plane, we appreciate God is ordaining right and wrong with respect to Egypt because of all the iniquities that the Egyptians had already perpetrated at this point. They are deserving of punishment. The idea that is enunciated, as we noted, by the Ran in Drashat Haran, that it was in order to get the Egyptians in their brazenness to fling themselves into the sea, and thereby be drowned, that they got, so to speak, ticked off by the slaves who had said they were only going for 3 days, not coming back. And it was all means to bring about the well-earned punishment of the Egyptians. All that's well and good, but it still is a subterfuge. And to that extent, obviously we appreciate God doesn't have any need to do things that way, but he's driving home a message to us. And obviously, beyond the specifics of the circumstances in context with respect to Egypt, the whole idea of the chok that we saw enunciated repeatedly throughout the Torah, and in particular, of course, among the commentators, we noted the idea enunciated by Rashi that the chukim, that component of the Torah that is described as chok, so to speak, engraved, usually translated as statutes, is that to which we relate as ein ta'am badavar, gzerat hamelech. No reason, the decree of the king. And we saw this likewise enunciated by Rabbi Yehuda Levi, who in particular emphasizes this point in the premier section in Sefer HaKuzarei, in which he does elaborate at length on Ta'amei Mitzvot, on reasons for the Mitzvot, on some point pertaining to temple service. Really, ideally, we shouldn't have been looking for this. And the tour de force in this regard, the Rambam himself emphasizes this point in the closing halakha of Sefer Avodah, Hilchot Milah Perek Chet, halakha Tet, halakha Chet, that the observance of the mitzvot needs to indeed be complete deference to the divine mandate, the chukim, and it is specifically by upholding both chukim and the mishpatim being the ordinances that the dimension with which we do resonate more readily, that the upright attain everlasting life. So again, that emphasis certainly was foundational, and perhaps the most vivid expression of this is it demands of us utmost self-sacrifice. This is not something that in any way, shape, or form is subservient to us. We become subservient to it. And the emphasis that we find in Midrash and in the commentators on our being prepared to sacrifice our lives for the Torah is ultimately an expression of this. That is, we defer. And returning on that plane to the starting point. The starting point of the source sheet was, you'll recall, the binding of Yitzchak. The point of emphasis with which we concluded last time of Rav Soloveitchik in Al HaTshuvah, in gleaning from the story of the Akedah, this message in some sense in all of its ferocity, as he expresses it, that even though the Torah, of course, forbids us to engage in human sacrifice, that's in some sense because of the technicality, because human sacrifice would entail either homicide or suicide, both of which are forbidden. But the idea that one should be prepared to sacrifice everything is inherent in the Torah. The idea is expressed it. Lo bitla et ha'irayon ki chayav adam la'akriv et atzmo. You should be prepared to dedicate yourself to the point of self-sacrifice for this corpus of the Torah. So again, all this subsumed in, as we entitled that component part, the inscrutable authoritarian imperative, the Torah as a chok. And it behooves us at this juncture to consider, if you will, the other side of the coin. The truth is there are a number of sides of coins that we still need to consider, but what we focus upon at this juncture is interpersonal mitzvot and beyond. The Torah as a divinely ordained moral code. Now, it would be fairly self-evident, perhaps one might even say trivial, to say that obviously, there are the interpersonal mitzvot in the Torah. They constitute the mishpatim, usually translated as ordinances, whatever ordinances mean. Mishpat from the root of mishpat, to judge, justice. Those mitzvot that resonate with our sense of justice, interpersonal mitzvot. To the extent that we speak of interpersonal mitzvot, it's almost a trivial exercise to say that aspect exists in the Torah. And that's why I stress here interpersonal mitzvot and beyond. Because it's not only that point of emphasis that pertains to the interpersonal mitzvot. And it's, if anything, in that vein that we consider something I know we've considered in the past as well, the dissension that we find in the Yerushalmi Tractate Nedarim, between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai regarding which verse in the Torah constitutes the Klal Gadol, the great principle of the Torah. And of course, famously, Rabbi Akiva says, "Ve'havtal re'acha kamocha, ze klal gadol b'Torah," that this imperative to love your fellow as yourself is the foundational principle of the Torah. And Ben Azai dissents, stating, "Ze sefer toldot Adam, ze klal gadol mizeh," that there is yet a greater principle, which is what we read in Parashat Bereshit, to be precise, chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the generations of man. B'yom bero Elokim Adam bitmut Elokim asa oto. On the day upon which God created man, he made him with divine likeness. And of course, inevitably, we consider the comparison between these two verses. We've noted this in the past, that as on the one hand, obviously, the verse cited by Rabbi Akiva has a tremendous advantage over the one cited by Ben Azai, in that it's explicitly prescriptive. It's telling you that you need to do something. Love your fellow as yourself. The verse cited by Ben Azai isn't prescriptive, it's descriptive. It's describing a state of affairs, but there isn't any explicit imperative that is encompassed by it. And at the same time, as the Korban Haida, classic commentator on the Yerushalmi, expresses it, it is considered by Ben Azai more foundational. Number one, because it's more universalist. That is, the verse cited by Rabbi Akiva, while explicitly prescriptive, is prescriptive only with respect to your rea, your fellow Jew, as opposed to, as the Korban Haida expresses it, the verse cited by Ben Azai pertains to all of humanity. Shekol bnei Adam ba'im me'av echad, that all of humanity hails from one source. Even if it's expressed as a descriptive rather than prescriptive statement, it certainly is far more far-reaching. But there's an additional dimension. The additional dimension is, if anything, perhaps even more intrinsic to our agenda at present. That one can also interpret, there are those who say that the emphasis in Ben Azai's citation of this verse, even though the Yerushalmi quotes only the first four words of the verse, but of course that's standard practice in the Talmud. The presumption of the sages is, if you cite the first few words of a verse, then anyone reading it is already going to be able to remember the rest of the verse by heart. The concluding words of the verse, Bidmut Elokim asa oto, that there's something, if you will, that impacts on your attitude with respect to your fellow man on a theological plane. Every human being is endowed with that divine likeness. And it is precisely as a reflection of that divine likeness that you need to be careful to not slight the dignity of your fellow man. And of course, it's in this vein that we likewise can appreciate on two different levels a kind of similar statement, the well-known response of Hillel to the Gentile who wanted to convert, but only on condition that you can tell me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. And Hillel converts him and says to him, Da'alach sanei lechavrach la ta'avid. What is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. Zohi kla Torah kula v'idach perusha hu zil gmor. That's the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Very often that last phrase of go and learn it gets omitted in translation. I'm wondering why. Certainly there's an emphasis here. You need to go and learn the rest of the Torah as well. Don't think that it's enough to just know that one line. But when we consider why this is a summation of the entire Torah, it's significant to note that what Rashi says in his commentary is that this cautiousness with respect to your friend, lechavrach la ta'avid, should be understood in the sense of the exposition in the Midrash on the verse in Mishlei, Proverbs chapter 27, your friend, so to speak, is an intimation of the Holy One, blessed be He. So there's an imperative here to be cautious, to not violate God's commands. Now, at first blush, what Rashi is telling you then is something that's a theological principle. It doesn't have anything to do with interpersonal mitzvot. He goes on as a lashon acher to say chavercha mamash, it's referring to your actual human friend, the various prohibitions that Rashi described as rov hamitzvot are how to behave towards your fellow man. And yet, while Rashi presents these as two disparate alternatives, there's obviously on some level a coherence between them, in that, after all, it is God who commanded you with respect to all these commandments as well. And indeed, as something of a further amplification of the idea expressed by Rashi, Rambam, in his Perush HaMishnah, the first Mishnah in Masechet Pe'ah, which talks about Gmilut Chasadim, Rambam emphasizes that Kol HaMitzvot sheben Adam lechavero nichnasot b'Gmilut Chasadim. All interpersonal mitzvot are subsumed within Gmilut Chasadim, and this becomes an all-encompassing principle. And indeed, it's in this vein that he cites the statement of Hillel to which we just referred. We'll note, additionally, a kind of further amplification of this by Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, toward the end of the guide, indeed, the next to last chapter on the subject of the reasons for the mitzvot. And here, Rambam Midralia mentions the mitzvah of not slaughtering the mother and its offspring in one day, and likewise sending away the mother bird before taking the offspring. And while prima facie, these are mitzvot that we don't see in any way as interpersonal. Indeed, they might even constitute chukim, perhaps, but Rambam overtly links them to the attitude that we need to cultivate with respect to our fellow man. That is, he stresses the modality of functioning of animals in this regard, because animals also feel anguish under these circumstances, and to that extent then kol shekem bivnei adam kulam, you have to behave yourself in a certain manner with respect to your fellow man. And it's not just this specific example. If anything, to broaden the canvas to the utmost degree, we, of course, are all well aware of the ostensibly purely theological, ecclesiastical mitzvah of ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. This is our relationship with God, to love God. Except that the Gemara in Tractate Yoma on page 86a explicitly understands as part and parcel of this mitzvah to behave in a manner that will cause the name of heaven, God's name, to be beloved through you. And what does that mean? Basically, it means to be a mensch, to behave in a manner that in your interpersonal relationships will inspire people to say, Ashrei aviv shli medot Torah, ashrei rabo shli medot Torah, oy lahem nabriot shelo lamdu Torah. That because you learned Torah, you became such a dignified, respectable, and caring human being. And the consequence of that, as the Gemara expresses it, is that God is glorified through Israel when we behave in this manner in our interpersonal relationships. And to what extent does this become indeed an imperative in the fulfillment of this mitzvah of ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha? Well, note the Midrash in Tanadvei Eliyahu Rabbah understands this as subsumed within Nimtza Shem Shamayim Mitkadesh Al Yado, the sanctification of God's name. And overtly, in the context of the Midrash Halacha on this verse, on Ve'avta et Hashem Elokecha, the Sifrei, and anticipating, of course, what you also see in the Gemara and later Midrashim, understands B'chol nafshecha afilu hol notel et nafshecha. With all of your soul, even if he takes your soul. And in as much as this exposition in the Sifrei, as we don't see in the Gemara, but in the Sifrei we see it explicitly, follows directly on the heels of the interpretation of Be'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha ahaveu al kol ha'briot ke'Avraham avicha. That you have an imperative to make God beloved by all creatures. We've done it in the past. Briot is, if anything, among all of the various pseudo-synonyms that refer to humanity, the lowest. The one that describes humanity is creatures. The only thing you have going for them is the fact they were created. And still in all, to ensure that God is beloved by them is an imperative of Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, with respect to which the Midrash tells you, Afilu hu notel et nafshecha, even if he takes your soul. I feel compelled to slightly digress and share with you a story that I read in the wake of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center 22 years ago. And this was actually a tale that was related in a book review of a book about what took place on that day, having nothing to do with any Jewish auspices of any sort. And yet the reviewer focuses upon, I'm reading from the review, the heroism and compassion displayed by civilians and uniformed rescuers alike. The authors returned several times to two Blue Cross computer analysts, Ed Baya, a 280-pound quadriplegic, and Abe Zelmanovitz, a slight Orthodox Jew, waiting for help on the 27th floor. Zalmanowitz encourages Baya's nurse to leave the building, saying he will stay with his wheelchair-bound friend. It would take 3 or 4 men to move Baya and his wheelchair, and the elevators are out of service, so the 2 men wait on the stairwell landing as evacuees stream past them. As they wait, Zalmanowitz helps Baya talk to his mother by dialing and holding Baya's cell phone to his ear. Firemen tell them periodically that someone eventually will be able to carry Baya out. Exhorted to leave numerous times, Zalmanowitz refuses. No, he says, according to a building staff member, I'm staying with my friend. The reader knows from the start how this grim story will end. And basing myself on nothing more than explicitly the Lashon of the Sifrei, I think it's imperative for us to enunciate that Abe Zalmanowitz fulfilled this summons. I don't know if we could express it as an imperative, maybe it's an imperative, of Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, Ahavehu al kol habriot, and Bechol nafshecha, afilu hu notelet nafshecha. To behave in a manner that will make God beloved by all creatures, to behave in that manner, even to the point of utmost self-sacrifice. So we emphasize this point because when one considers a mitzvah like Ve'ahavta Hashem Elokecha at first brush, one doesn't really think about it in terms of a moral code, but the Midrash does. You'll note that Rambam also does. That is, Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot, the third mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvot is Ahavat Hashem. And in Rambam's definition of the mitzvah in Sefer HaMitzvot, in his compendium of the mitzvot, he includes this as an integral component. That it isn't only that you need to love Hashem, but שנדרוש ונקרא האנשים כולם לאהבתו יתברך ולהאמין בו, וזה כשתאהב אדם תשים לבך עליו ותשבחהו ותבקש האנשים לאהוב אותו. If you really love God, you will do your utmost to ensure that all of humanity loves God as well. An interesting question is why this aspect of mitzvot ahavat Hashem doesn't appear explicitly in Hilchot Yisodei Torah, where Rambam speaks of the mitzvah ahavat Hashem. I have a number of proposals with respect to answering that question. It could be that Rambam subsumes what he's saying with respect to ahavat Hashem here in the mitzvah, which is also, of course, elaborated upon in Hilchot Torah of L'Kadesh Shem Shamayim. And of course, the emphasis in L'Kadesh Shem Shamayim is explicitly including self-sacrifice. When one considers the third level of L'Kadesh Shem Shamayim that Rambam enumerates in Hilchot Torah, I think it could well be seen as an elaboration on this principle. In any case, what it certainly entails is the realization that what might strike us as exclusively ben adam lamakom, a mitzvah between man and God, has ramifications with respect to the moral code that is indeed inherent in the Torah. Taking an additional example that perhaps is even more explicit, when one considers in Parashat Ve'et Chanan the imperative of ve'asita yashar ve'atov be'einei Hashem, to do that which is upright and good in the eyes of God. And what does this entail? So Rashi already tells you, the name of Chazal, that hayashar ve'atov means lifnim mishurat hadin. Now we've already noted in the past, lifnim mishurat hadin is an expression. How do we translate this into English? We can't. Because usually lifnim mishurat hadin is translated as going beyond the letter of the law, and lifnim doesn't mean beyond, it means within. Because lifnim mishurat hadin means, so to speak, reading between the lines, not merely being in conformance with the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law that is between the lines, as it were. And in this regard, we note in particular Ramban's commentary on this imperative, where beyond the citation of what Rashi says. Ramban says, I didn't actually find midrash that Rashi is presumably basing himself upon, and that Ramban is alluding to, but nonetheless, certainly Rashi says that it is going lifnim mishurat hadin, and then Ramban goes on to enunciate a principle. The truth of the matter is, this is a principle that Ramban enunciates in a number of places in his Torah commentary, that we have the whole gamut of imperatives, prohibitions that pertain to the way you need to regulate your behavior toward your fellow man. And we might regard that as enough. You have these discrete imperatives and prohibitions that pertain to the way you need to behave towards your fellow man. And then you have this one. And this isn't a specific imperative. Indeed, it is veritably impossible to tack it down to the corners and say exactly what this includes. Because this is demanding of you not merely subscribing to a set of imperatives, but to cultivate an attitude. And perhaps the best way of illustrating this, again, this pertains to multiple comments of Ramban, to which we will still be making reference up ahead. If I can indulge in a mathematical analogy, every mitzvah is like a point plotted on coordinate axes. So you have all these points, but points don't constitute a function. You can't take a derivative of discrete points. You need a curve to be able to analyze what's going on. So you have all these discrete points, but they don't in and of themselves give you that curve, that attitude. And then you have ve'asita yashar ve'atov, and that's exactly what it does. It gives you an imperative to cultivate a certain attitude with respect to your fellow man. And note that this is explicitly enunciated in the context of your relationship with God. Do that which is upright and good in the eyes of God, but it has implications with respect to the way you need to behave towards your fellow man, and that's critical. So, of course, this is a general observation that is of utmost importance in cultivating this idea of the Torah as a divinely ordained moral code. What we'll note as an inevitable extension of this principle is the significance that we find ascribed in general to gemilut chasadim, to acts of loving kindness. That is, of course, the first example, which we already noted, is the citation that occasions Rambam's commentary on how expansive gemilut chasadim is. The Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Pe'ah, that in the list of those matters that have no measure, no limit, includes gemilut chasadim. Likewise, in the list of those matters with respect to which an individual, in the expression of the Mishnah, is able to, so to speak, live off the accrued value in this world, but the principle still persists for the world to come. And all the ensuing citations, we're not going to go through them all in detail, further amplify just how central Gemilut Chasadim is. That Gemilut Chasadim is even greater than Tzedakah, and moreover, again, to note the extent to which Gemilut Chasadim is not merely something that connects with the interpersonal level of mitzvot. It's something that connects us with God. The Gemara in Tractate Sotah, page 14a, famously, Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina asks what is meant, at least what's meant on some kind of practicable plane by Acharei Hashem Elokechem Telechu, to go after God. Is it possible for man to go after God's presence? God is likened to an all-consuming fire. So, of course, inevitably, I always know that when you read this line, you need to ask, he didn't understand what a metaphor is. He thought that if you go after God, you're going to get third-degree burns and you'll end up in a burn unit in a hospital. And of course, the answer is, of course he understood that's a metaphor. But in the sense that Acharei Hashem Elokei Lechem Telechu is also a metaphor. It implies that you are aspiring to a level of intimacy with God, and that level of intimacy with God is impossible. Just as you cannot grasp physical fire with your physical hands, and the attempt to do so will destroy the tools that you have for grasping because your hands will be incinerated. So too you can't grasp God. Obviously not with your hands, mind, whatever. You can't grasp God. The attempt to do so will destroy your mind. So what then is the imperative of to go after the attributes of the Holy One to be? And what does that mean in practice? So the Gemara gives you discrete illustrations, but they all amount to one basic principle. The discrete illustrations are just as God clothes the naked, as he clothed Adam and Chava, you clothe the naked. God visited the ill, to the extent that we understand the opening verse of Vayera as God, so to speak, visiting Abraham when he's convalescing after circumcision. You visit the ill. God consoled mourners, as we read after the death of Abraham, God blesses Yitzchak, and the Gemara says this is the blessing, so to speak, of consolation. You too console mourners. Finally, culminating at the end of the Torah with Hakadosh Baruch Hu Kaba Meitim Afatak Kvar Meitim. God buried the dead. The simple conjugation of Vayikbo Oto Bagai, that God buried Moshe after his death. You too bury the dead. So you have all these discrete examples. What do they amount to? Gemilut Chasadim, engaging in acts of kindness. And small wonder that just a little bit afterward, in the Gemara, we have the exposition of Rabbi Smalai. The Torah in its beginning and its end is Gemilut Chasadim. Now, Maharal understands this, if you will, on a homiletical plane, that the beginning of the Torah is Gemilut Chasadim, not simply because the beginning of the Torah gives us this example of clothing the naked, but rather that the undergirding from which the Torah springs is Gemilut Chasadim. So the end of the Torah is Gemilut Chasadim, not merely because of the burial of Moshe that appears at the end of the Torah, but because the goal toward which the entire Torah is oriented is Gemilut Chasadim. But the bottom line then is that this principle of Gemilut Chasadim is what defines the starting point and the culmination of the Torah. As Maharal expresses, of course, in the middle, you also have all the laws and judgments. But it's important for us to understand they are means to a goal. The goal is Gemilut Chasadim. They spring from a source. The source is Gemilut Chasadim. So the Gemara speaks of its beginning and end. You have the Midrash that says it also applies to the middle. That is, the Midrash in Tanchuma on Parashat Vayishlach, so the other cognate Midrashim that I cite here, also commenting on Acharei Hashem Elokechem Telechu and other verses as well, about going after God, emphasizes this point of Gemilut Chasadim and states by way of conclusion, Tchilat HaTorah Gemilut Chasadim ve'emtzaita Gemilut Chasadim ve'sofa Gemilut Chasadim, that the Torah beginning, middle, and end is all about Gemilut Chasadim, and all of that amounts to, again, Tilchu Acham Mikdatav Shakadosh Baruch Hu, to follow the attributes of God. So following the attributes of God, imitate Yodei, to behave in a godly manner. But behaving in a godly manner is going to have implications not with respect to something that is, if you will, ecclesiastical, that not with respect to something that's going to be theological, but with respect to the way you behave toward your fellow man. And of course, to that extent, we find in the literary legacy of Chazal even stronger expressions. The Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah telling us Kol Osek B'Torah Bilvad, one who engages in Torah alone, and the context makes it clear that means Torah without Gemilut Chasadim, the Mekim Mishein Lo Elah, resembles one who has no God. Simple pshat. What does that mean? If you're only engaging in Torah and it's not going to have this transitive effect on you of impelling you to bestow kindness on others, that just as you are a beneficiary of God's giving, so you too become a giver, then evidently you're not really studying Torah. You're merely engaging in your own, if you will, whatever, self-enlightenment. But it's all, look out for number one. It's not an act of service. So such a person resembles one who has no God. And perhaps even in stronger terms, that one who denies kindness, as it were, denies God. Perhaps even more strongly, the Gemara in Tractate Kiddushin at the end of the first chapter, giving us an analysis, as it were, on a verse in Yeshayahu that talks about a tzaddik tov, as implying, and you could have someone who is righteous who is not tov, who's no good. And the Gemara understands that if you have someone who is tov l'shamayim vera labriot, good in his theological realm, in his relationship with God, but he's bad toward briot, again, that lowest denominator of humanity. Zel tzaddik she'eino tov. This is a righteous man who is no good. He may be considered righteous, he's still considered no good. And finally, an additional dimension that it behooves us to stress in this regard in particular is what we make of Pirkei Avot. Because, of course, Pirkei Avot is very largely, by no means exclusively, but very largely focused upon the ethical dimension of Judaism. And the question is how to understand that. Now, we note that the Gemara in Masechet Baba Kama makes a statement, only 1/3 of which pertains to Pirkei Avot, because the statement of Rav Yehuda is, if one wishes to become pious, one should fulfill the words of Nezikin. And presumably on the most basic plane, to avoid any impinging upon someone else's property. That's the key to Chassidut, to being pious. Rava Amar Milei De'avot. And Rava says, a person who wants to be pious should fulfill the words of Avot, of ethics of the fathers. And there's a third opinion, the words of brachot. Because after all, brachot, as in particular Rabbi Yehuda Levi enunciates the point in Sefer HaKuzarei, in the third treatise thereof, raise us to a higher level of consciousness. But we'll put that on the side for now. With respect to Avot, of course, famously, glaringly, Avot begins with, so to speak, a genealogy of the transmission of Torah. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, handed it over to Yeshua, Yeshua to the elders, the prophets handed it over to the men of the Great Assembly. We don't find a statement like that anywhere else in the Mishnah. Why specifically here? And the Meiri makes a proposition in his introduction to Avot. In a certain vein, this idea is resonant with an idea expressed by Rabbi Avadia ben Bartanura in his commentary at the beginning of Pirkei Avot as well. Says the Meiri, in as much as the general statements in the Mishnah of Avot do not have some specific support from a discrete scriptural verse, nor from the normative system through which we derive Talmudic law, one might come to think that all of these laws are not to be regarded as relevant to specific fulfillment of the Torah, to our veneration of the religious obligations of the Torah. And as a result, specifically in Pirkei Avot, there's the need to emphasize the chain of the tradition, going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, Mipi Agvura, Moshe getting it from God, to recognize that the precepts of Avot are indeed to be deemed Torah, and not to be deemed some kind of, if you will, societal refinement. In something of the same vein, this is indeed what Rabbi Ovadia Bartanura expresses in his commentary at the beginning of Avot, that since this Masechet is not based upon the explication of some particular mitzvah, like all the other tractates of the Mishnah, one might have been inclined to think that Avot should be relegated to the same category as the sort of genre that we find among all nations, because after all nations compose books on ethics. So you might think it's just another book on ethics that signifies nothing more sublime than the innate moral sense of which we spoke 2 weeks ago. And as a result, emphasizes Bartanura that all this is indeed to be deemed part of the chain of descent of Torah. And I feel compelled to note that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, in his Lechem Shemaim commentary on Avot, lays into Bartanura. And I assume that if he would have had the Meiri in front of him, he would have laid into the Meiri for the same reason. Namely, to say that these imperatives in Avot are not based upon something discrete, specific that we find in the Torah, is something that Rabbi Yaakov Emden says he doesn't understand. That is, all of the upright character traits and ethical principles have a basis in the Torah, in the halachta bidrachav, to go in the ways of God, as we've already noted, and they likewise can be linked to ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your fellow as yourself. Indeed, as we already noted, even to loving God. Therefore, these precepts in Avot are not in any way less ordained by the Torah than the other precepts that we find in the Mishnah. And on some plane, I apologize if this is going to sound excessively pedestrian, but I'm going to say, I don't know if there's such a big argument between them here. That is, I appreciate that Rabbi Yaakov Emden wanted to stress that indeed all of the precepts of Avot are truly grounded in the Torah. In some plane, I'm going to say that's exactly what the Meiri and the Bartanura wanted to stress as well. They express themselves in different words. But the idea that there is indeed an imperative in the Torah to behave in a morally exalted manner is something with which they all agree. And of course, it is in precisely this vein that we will appreciate the thrust of the famous Baraita of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. He gives you a whole long chain of cause and effect. Torah brings you to being cautious brings you to being diligent brings you to being pure, clean in the manner in which you behave yourself, and that brings you to a level of withdrawal from the physical, and so on and so forth, a chain of growth and development. And ultimately, this brings you to piety. And piety brings you to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit brings you to resurrection of the dead. The realization that there is a lengthy string of cause and effect that ultimately is the means through which, and the only means through which, you can truly become pious. And this inevitably brings us back to something that we discussed previously. That is, I remind you, we noted that the concept of chassid, in the sense of chassid umot ha'olam, of pious nations of the world, does not demand having studied. On the contrary, in as much as that system of Torah that is in need of being learned applies as an obligation explicitly to Israel. For the nations of the world, they can attain piety on an intuitive plane, resonating with that inner moral sense with which every human being is endowed. But not so with Israel. You can't be pious if you haven't truly learned the Torah. And this, of course, is the principle, as we've noted on multiple occasions heretofore, that is expressed by Hillel in the second chapter of Avot, Lo Am Haaretz Chasid, that the ignoramus cannot attain that level of Chasidut. On the contrary, as we noted, that if the ignoramus attempts to reach that level of Chasidut, then he is liable to become that oxymoronic monstrosity, the Chasid Shoteh, the pious fool who has a completely warped sense of priorities because he hasn't studied Torah and he thinks he should, upon hearing a woman screaming as she's drowning at sea, stop up his ears to not hear her screams and let her drown. And of course, concomitantly, the other side of this coin is what we find relentlessly emphasized in the commentaries, particularly on this Mishnah, that the attainment of this level of Chassidut indeed requires mastery of Torah. And mastery of Torah, of course, this is inevitably the other side of the same coin, is going to bring a person, a sincere student of the Torah, to this level of Chassidut, to an understanding of Lifnim Mishurat Adin, which of course is the sine qua non of Chassidut. Again, not in the sense of going beyond the letter of the law, because going beyond the letter of the law is liable to be out of bounds, and sometimes out of bounds in very dangerous ways, but rather to be able to read between the lines, to be able to incorporate Torah into one's life on a plane that is indeed within the letters themselves, a resonance with the spirit rather than only the imperatives. And you'll note in this regard, perhaps a particularly striking illustration, that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has the Jewish mentor introducing himself and his beliefs in Sefer Kuzari, the first treatise, section 11, specifically in the context of his believing in what amounts to the God of historical experience. And he speaks exclusively of historical experience, and what is so glaringly lacking from this presentation of the Chaver is one iota of theology. Theology isn't mentioned. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, of course, is writing the script here for both the mentor and the Khazar king, has the king miffed by this absence of theology, and he specifically contends with him, criticizes him. Should you have said that you believe in the creator of the world, who orders it and guides it, who created you and provides you with your sustenance, and so on, the attributes that are claimed by every theist, because of which he seeks the truth in order to emulate the Creator in his justice and wisdom. In summation, the argument of the king, you need to talk theology in order to become a mensch, in order to be engaged in this imitatio Dei, emulating God. And while obviously, again, Rabbi Levi is writing the script, there is a clear undergirding here, because indeed, the other religions speak much more about theology than Jews do. But I suspect that when Rabbi Levi expresses the critique through the king in the manner that he does, he is tacitly guiding us to recall, wait, we have a principle. The principle is expressed in the Mechilta, also in the Gemara Masechet Shabbat on page 133b, also in the Yerushalmi, on specifically the second verse of Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. On Ze Keli ve'anvehu, this is my God and Anvehu. I will extol him. There are a number of translations from Anvehu. The question is exactly what it means. And on the one hand, there's the exposition of Rabbi Eliezer that speaks of the attainment of a level of prophecy by even the commoners who experienced the splitting of the sea. But on the other hand, what is particularly germane for our purposes is the exposition of Abba Shaul. Nidmelo, mahu rachum bechanon, af ata rachum bechanon. That Anvehu means, this is my God and I will be like him. He is compassionate and free-giving, so I too aspire to being compassionate and free-giving. In other words, it's not the theology that's going to make you into a mensch. It's experiencing God. That experience of God is precisely what guides you to striving to internalize in your life godly conduct. And that, of course, is the critical message. And of course, to that extent, the emphasis that is enunciated by Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, Tiferet Yisrael, on Avot, the opening Mishnah of Avot, that the reason the Mishnah begins with receiving the Torah is so one won't think that it's enough to just study Torah, if you will, on a theological, on an ecclesiastical plane, without refining one's character. You could say that the Tiferet Yisrael is the other side of the same coin. That the reason that the Mishnah begins with Moshe received the Torah from Sinai is because that needs to be a starting point. And that receipt of the Torah needs to find its expression crucially, critically, in internalizing into your life the derech eretz, the proper mode of character that is engendered by Torah. If you haven't gotten that, you really haven't gotten anything. And of course, it's in this vein, as a final note, that we observe the point of emphasis in the Sifra, the Midrash Halacha, on Ushmartem et chukotai vet mishpatai asher yaseh otam ha'adam b'chai bahem. That, of course, we note the verse refers to chukim and mishpatim, and the emphasis on doing them and living through them. We're, of course, very familiar with other expositions on this verse. The point I'm going to emphasize in the Sifra right now is Asher Yaseh Otam Ha'adam V'chai Bahem. Doesn't say anything about Israel. The Midrash makes this observation that from this we learn that if a Gentile is doing the Torah, he is likened to a Kohen Gadol. Because after all, the verse didn't say Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. It spoke about Ha'adam. And the Midrash cites various other verses that enunciate the same principle. Rav Hirsch elaborates on this theme in his Torah commentary and also one other spot. I'm going to share with you what he states in this regard because I think it's so edifying for us all. It does not say Asher ta'asu otam v'tichyu bahem, but Asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem, referring to all of humanity. It does not say Adam, but ha'adam, that is, everybody who strives to realize to himself and by himself the high human moral and spiritual character which is expressed by this appellation. Hence, in Torah Kanim, the aforementioned Midrash, the significant sentences, and Rav Hirsch cites them all of them are verses that speak of being spiritually exalted through the Torah, even if one is not a member of Israel. Even a non-Jew who keeps God's laws is equal of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. For it says, which a man shall fulfill and live, and so on and so forth, all various other examples that the Midrash cites. From all these quotations from the Holy Writ, it follows that even a non-Jew who fulfills the law of God is equal to the Kohen Gadol life, the teaching, the proximity to God, happiness and well-being is not open solely for Yisrael with these Torah laws, but for everyone. Everyone who draws their outlook on life and men out of them and bases the principles of his life on them, who elevates himself to the heights of pure humanity by keeping their chukim and mishpatim. Anybody and everybody is therefore ensured the attainment of the highest degree of perfection and happiness possible for a human being to reach in nearness to God. But this establishes the fact that for a correct estimation of these chukim and mishpatim, which regulate the whole of Jewish individual, private as well as social life, they are nothing exceptional, nothing calculated for supermen or out of the ordinary. They're just meant, starting with the Jewish family of mankind, to ensure that the stage of human life shall be regained, which was the original purpose and which still remains the purpose of a race of beings, humanity, not one component of humanity, created in the likeness of God, and to guide the whole of the human race up to such a level which is the meaning of God's direction of the whole of world history. This is why the whole summary of all the happiness which is to blossom and mature from these chukim and mishpatim is crystallized in these words, v'chai bahem, to live by them, through them. Nothing more, nothing less is to be won from their observance than v'chai, the highest conception of having positively and truly lived. And we'll just note one final aspect in this regard. This is a relatively ancillary observation of Rav Hirsch in his commentary on Tehillim, on Psalm 25, where he distinguishes between the respective meanings of derech and orach. Usually we translate derech as way and orach as path. But they're seeming pseudo synonyms, and in short, Rav Hirsch concludes that derech is a full-fledged Weltanschauung that encompasses everything. Denotes the striving of an individual for the fulfillment of his personal desires, either approved or condemned by moral law. Orach isn't that all-encompassing Weltanschauung. It is preponderantly employed to indicate the social path which man walks in his relationships with his fellow men. And as such, proposes Rav Hirsch that when we read in Yeshayahu, chapter 2, verse 3, that many peoples will go and say, let us go up to the house of the Lord, to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Yaakov, v'yorenu miderachav v'nelecha be'orechotav. To be precise, and he will teach us of his derachim, of his ways, v'nelecha be'orechotav, and we will go in his orachim, in the orachim. That derech is this expansive thing that doesn't necessarily apply to the entire world. Not the entire world is going to subscribe to all of the strata of the Torah. But the orachim, the social mores, unequivocally should be accepted by all of humanity. So with respect to the derachim, it's v'yorenu miderachav, only of the way. Whereas with respect to the orachim, the whole gamut, because the whole gamut is going to ultimately be the means through which we attain that lofty goal and that critical acquisition in our lives, the realization that the Torah is indeed a divinely ordained moral code, which of course it is. It's also a lot more than that. And Bezrat Hashem, on that note, we're going to have to continue next time.